Welcome to Free Christian Church of God's Video Outreach Ministry, bringing the gospel message of Jesus Christ into your home each and every Sunday morning. If you would like more information about the video ministry or other ministries that we have to offer, stay tuned immediately following this program. And now, open your Bibles and follow along as we bring you today's message.
I said last week, here is the key. It is the complete picture of the Old Testament and the New Testaments together that reveals to us the truth about God and the truth about sin and about forgiveness and salvation and everything else that we need to know. That key is both of them together. You're not going to be a master of the New Testament until you have knowledge of the Old Testament. Now, we've already gone through the Old Testament, and hopefully you've got more knowledge about that than what you had before. But don't be afraid to read the Old Testament. You know, a lot of times when people sit down to read their Bible, and they go, okay, where am I going to read? Now, I don't know how you choose where you're going to read. I mean, I remember the day when I used to go, begats, you know? And so you need to have some sort of order to it, but don't be afraid to go back and read your Old Testament. You're going to find it fruitful, because then when you get into the New Testament, you're going to have a deeper understanding of what's going on there. The word testament means covenant. A covenant is a compact or an agreement between two parties. So the Old Testament is the old contract. The New Testament is the new contract. The Old Testament is the contract between who? Who are the two parties? God and the Jews. Yep, God and the Hebrew people. And so the New Testament is a new contract between who? God and everybody. Okay. God and the church. God and everyone, basically. There are 400 years between the Testaments. Now, we studied this a little bit at the end of last year. And that's a huge separation. I got to think about that. 400 years between the Old Testament and the New. For 400 years, God didn't speak. 400 years. There were no prophets. There were nobody proclaiming the message. There was no new word from God for 400 years. That means that a lot of people were born, raised, died, never heard a word from the Lord. Matter of fact, for generation to generation. You know, this country is 200 and some years old. Almost double that time, nobody had a word from God. And so we talked about it before, how people came up with their own ideas or the things that they wanted people to hang on to, and they began recording that, and they began telling those stories and creating those traditions, which degenerated into the situation that Jesus came into in the New Testament. 400 years of separation, and yet the theme is the same. God is the same God in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and Jesus Christ is the unifying theme. He's the one that crosses that gap, that 400-year gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We sometimes forget that Jesus is also the central character of the Old Testament as well as of the New Testament. You know, we think, well, the New Testament is the story of Jesus, the Old Testament is just, boring history, which isn't true. You know, if we had the time, I would go through and show you the many images of Jesus Christ that we find out throughout the Old Testament. St. Augustine said, the New Testament is veiled in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is unveiled in the New Testament. Somebody else said the new is the old concealed, and the old is the new revealed. And there's all kinds of things like that. But you can't be an expert on the New Testament truths until you understand their birth in the Old Testament Scriptures. You might think, I know my New Testament. I know the books in order. I've read them over and over again. But until you get a handle on the Old Testament, they're not going to have near the meaning to you. It's the understanding of the Old Testament that gives depth to the New Testament story. The New Testament is a new covenant. Now, that doesn't mean that the Old Covenant is null and void. You know, some people think that, well, we have a New Testament, therefore we don't have to pay any attention to what the Old Testament says. You know, the Old Testament has the Ten Commandments, but they're not any good anymore because now we have a New Testament. That's not true. That's not true. the Old Testament has been fulfilled in the New Testament, but it's not. It has not eliminated the Old Testament. Now, but why did we need a New Testament? I mean, why didn't we just go on from where it was? Why did God put a major break there in history and a major break to come into the time of the New Testament? Why did we need a new covenant? Tertullian, who lived around from 1600 or 160 to 220 A.D., he was an early church father. He was the first to employ the Latin words novum testamentum to describe this section of the Bible. He was the guy that named it the New Testament. It was a translation of the Greek words he kaine diatheke, which means the new will, or the new covenant, or the new contract. The Old Testament prophet Jeremiah predicted that the old covenant would be supplanted by a new one. In Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 31, he says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah." Jesus Christ claimed that the new covenant would be established in the blood of his sacrificial death. When he was administering the Lord's Supper, Matthew 26 and verse 28, he said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Even the New Testament writers declare the contrast between the old covenant made with Israel and ratified with animal blood to the new covenant made with the church through the blood of Jesus Christ. I ask you who the covenant was between. The New Testament covenant is between God and the church. Who's the church? Who are the church? Those that belong to him, whether they're Jew or Gentile. The major theme of both testaments is, however, Jesus Christ. Some unknown author wrote, "If the Old Testament bears witness preeminently to the one who is to come, the New Testament bears witness to the one who has come." But Jesus is still the theme. The practices and the symbolism of the Old Testament point directly to Jesus Christ. You know, I showed you, the tabernacle and all of the things about the tabernacle that related to Jesus Christ. I don't know if you recall back when we studied the tabernacle that I told you what I believed for my study, what I believed that tabernacle represented. You know, when God told Moses he wanted him to build the tabernacle, he took him up into his presence and he showed him the real thing. And then he said, "I want you to go build what you have seen." And so Moses went down to earth and he had all of the details and he built it exactly as God had seen it. For a long time I used to think that, Moses went into the presence of God and there he saw a heavenly tabernacle. But the more I studied it, the more I began to understand it, I realized that what he saw was God. And what he did was create a structure that shows us who God is, an image of God. And when it was completely finished in finest detail, the Bible says the Shekinah glory of God came down, and God put it on because it was a perfect fit. That's what the church is supposed to be. We are supposed to be the reflection of God to the world. People are supposed to look at this place and see who God is. And that's why there are things that we have to change. When we get more knowledge of that and we get better understanding of that, there are things that we have to change. You know, we put that sign up above the door as you come into the sanctuary. And we did it several months ago based upon what we had learned and what the sanctuary should be and what it's supposed to be. And now I know we have people walk in here on Sunday morning who don't even know that it's up there, who have forgotten about it, who've forgotten to read it. But that's exactly what I'm trying to point out to you here, is all of the things that God has showed us about Jesus in the Old Testament. So that when Jesus Christ came into the earth, we should have recognized him. We should have known who he is. But because we don't have knowledge of the Old Testament, we miss him. Here's a good way to look at it. The Old Testament is the preparation for Christ. It's laying the groundwork. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the manifestation of Christ. The Acts of the Apostles is the propagation of Christ, the spreading of who he is. The epistles are the explanation of Christ, and the revelation is the consummation of Christ. Now, when we studied the Old Testament, to make it less scary, we broke it down into pieces. I have found throughout my lifetime that if I have something that is gigantic, it's intimidating, and I just want to throw up my hands and walk away. But if I break it down into manageable pieces, it scares me a whole lot less, and I'm way more apt to dig into it. And so we did that with the Old Testament. We broke it down into categories. And that I want to do with the New Testament. This should be easier. There's less books. Okay? The first category is that of biography. Anybody know what a biography is? Story. Thank you, Pastor Lisa. Okay. You see, she teaches too, and she likes it when people answer in her class too. There are 4 books of biography. Anybody know what they are? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That was pretty easy, wasn't it? There was 1 book of history. Anybody want to venture a guess? Acts. The Acts of the Apostles. There are 13 books of Pauline epistles. Anybody know what that is? Anybody know what the Pauline epistles are?
Letters of Paul. Letters from Paul.
Letters from Paul. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. All of the letters that the Apostle Paul wrote. And then there are the general epistles. There are 8 books of those. Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. And finally, there's 1 book of prophecy, which is Revelation. Okay. Good job. Good job. Those are the categories. Now, I've broken it down into those categories, and what we're going to do is we study it. We're going to study it by category. Okay? Now, to really mess you up, we're going to start with division number 1, which is the Gospels. The books of 4 books of biography. The word gospel is derived from the Anglo-Saxon word Godspell, which meant good tidings. It meant good tidings. And later, the story concerning God. We think of that the Gospels are books. When we say, turn to the Gospel of Matthew, we think, turn to the book of Matthew. Turn to the Gospel of Luke. We think we're going to the book of Luke. But in the New Testament, the word gospel never meant book. But it always meant the good tidings which Christ and the apostles announced. It always meant the good news. Turn to the good news. So we could say, turn to the good news, and you just turn to your entire Bible, right? Because that's the good news. Originally, there were apocryphal gospels, false gospels that were circulating among the early churches. Now, this would make things really confusing. You know, you think you lived in an era where you didn't really have like the local library, certainly didn't have the internet. You know, there was nothing to Google, and you didn't have a search engine, so you kind of had what was there. And in that day, people began doing a lot of writing for whatever reason, and there were a lot of things that were labeled the gospel that circulated among the churches. Now, can you imagine what kind of problem that would be? You know, if we really didn't have anything okay, this is the Bible. What if we just all found a book that we thought was Bible, and we all brought it into church on Sunday morning? Can you imagine what a mess that would be? These were books that were not inspired. They were not infallible. They were not free from moral or doctrinal or historical errors. They were not written by authenticated apostles or by their associates. They contained fanciful legends and mere repetition of some Bible truths. It's thought that many of these were written simply to enhance or to advance certain heretical views. Remember that 400 years where people build up their own traditions and their own ideas. And so they begin to write books that were supposedly Bible truth. So you see, it was necessary that God distinguish which Gospels that He wanted us to read and which ones He didn't want us to read. By the providence of God, utilizing the holiness and the spiritual discernment of godly men, the canon of the Scriptures was created. The canon of the Scriptures are the books that we have in our Bible. Every book that you have in your Bible met a very rigid list of conditions before they were accepted into this book. You know the book of James. The book of James talks about works, and how we ought to have works, but how faith without works is dead. there was a big struggle when the canon was being put together because of that. And there was a big struggle over the book of James. So it wasn't just a group of people that got together and say, okay, we'll take this book, and this book. It was years of Bible minds, of spiritual people discerning what the truth of God was to arrive at the four that we have. It's kind of made me wonder how many books written on Christianity today have truly been sanctioned by God. You know, there are tons and tons and tons of books out there, and people are reading so many. That's why I want to get that new church built. I want to get that bookstore in it, and I want to make sure that we put in that bookstore books that are safe for Christians to read. You know, somebody will say, hey, I just read this in a book. And I'll say, by who? And they will tell me who wrote it, and I'll say, I don't know them. If I don't know them, how can I trust what they say to be true? Well, it's in a book. That's as bad as it's on TV, or I heard it at the coffee shop, you know. But why did God choose 4 Gospels? You ever think about that? Why did God give us 4 Gospels? I mean, why didn't God just give us the Gospel? One book telling us about the life of Jesus Christ. Have you ever heard the expression, 2 heads are better than 1? One perspective gives us a one-dimensional point of view. But 4 perspectives gives us a more clear picture. The 4 Gospels do just that. They give us 4 perspectives on Jesus Christ in a much clearer picture than each individual Gospel if it was standing alone. Now, let me illustrate. You don't really know me. Now, some of you know me better than other people do. But to really know me, you can't just know me as the pastor of the church. See, some people do that. They only know me as pastor of the church, and they associate with me with the pulpit, standing up here, screaming and yelling, waving my arms around, acting like a maniac, and I scare those people because they don't know me. They only know this end of it. But if you really want to get to know me, you need to know me as a pastor. You also need to know my wife's perspective on me as a husband. You need to know my children's perspective on me as a father. And you need to know my parents' perspective on me as a son. If you get to know those 4 things, you're going to know a whole lot better who I am. You're going to understand me a whole lot more. What I'm saying is if you want a clear picture of who Jesus Christ is, then you have to read all 4 Gospels together. Some people think if they just read one Gospel, that's enough, but that's nowhere near the truth. And let me show you what I mean. Matthew was a Levite. Matthew emphasized Jesus as the Messiah. His perspective on Jesus, he is the Messiah. He's the Christ. He's the one that we've waited for throughout the Old Testament. He is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Each of the subtleties of his design supports this primary theme throughout the book. His genealogy that he gives starts with the first Jew, Abraham. And he continues on in that genealogy through David and the royal line till he gets to Joseph, who was the legal father of Jesus. Matthew's emphasis is on the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament. As a customs official, Matthew was skilled in shorthand. Now, this is cool to know. There was a real asset in a culture that didn't have the advantages of printing presses and copiers and things like that. Matthew focuses on what Jesus said. He focuses on what Jesus said, and he includes very extensive discourses, which he probably was able to take down verbatim. Can you imagine that? That he's sitting there hearing the Sermon on the Mount and taking notes. And that's how it ended up in our hands. Matthew's first miracle is the cleansing of a leper. It was a Jewish metaphor for sin itself. Matthew concludes with the resurrection, which is also distinctive Jewish preoccupation. The resurrection was major in their minds. Luke, on the other hand, was a Gentile, and he was a doctor. And his gospel reflects a very distinctive point of view. He emphasizes Jesus as the Son of Man. Where Matthew showed Jesus as the Messiah, he's showing him as the Son of Man. His genealogy begins with Adam, the first man, instead of Abraham, the first Jew. From Abraham to David, his list is identical to the list of Matthew, except for when he gets to David, he doesn't track through Solomon, who was the first surviving son of Bathsheba, but he tracks through a different son, Nathan, the second surviving son of Bathsheba. He continues on through to Heli, the father of Mary. As a Gentile, Luke's emphasis is different. It'd have to be. His emphasis is Christ's humanity. He focuses on what Jesus felt. Where Matthew focused on what he said, Luke focuses on what Jesus felt. His first miracle is the expulsion of a demon. Real human concern. Luke concludes with the promise of the giving of the Holy Spirit, which becomes a natural bridge into the second book that he wrote, the book of Acts. Now, that's two perspectives. But then along comes Mark, who I assume was probably the youngest of the group. Mark was the amanuensis, or the secretary for Peter. He was Peter's associate. And he emphasizes Jesus as the obedient servant of Yahweh. His is the only gospel that shows no concern for pedigree or genealogy. There is no genealogy in Mark. So if you want to, if you're picking a place to read and you're going to do this, Mark's a good place to land. No begats. But Mark focuses on what Jesus did. He deals with graphic images, almost like a movie or a video shooting script. Mark concludes with the final visual appearance, which is the ascension of Christ. Now we're getting a better picture of who Jesus is. And then we get to John. John was even more distinct, I think, than the rest. He emphasizes Jesus as the Son of God. Somebody said, okay, if God is his father, Mary was his mother, is Jesus like half God and half man? No. That's the idea of the Gospels. That's the perspective. Jesus was all God and all man at the same time. There's never been anybody like him. There will never be anybody like him. All God and all man at the same time. Only in John's genealogy, he focuses on who Jesus was. In his genealogy, it's that of a genealogy that leads to God. His gospel is organized around 7 miracles, 7 discourses, and 7 I am statements. 7, the number of God. John's first miracle involves the use of the water of purification being changed into wine. The very first biblically recorded miracle is Jesus turning the water into wine. When we read this, most people, even church people, get hung up on the wine part, and they miss the entire purpose of what Jesus did. Some people say, oh, yeah, well, but he turned it into wine, therefore I can go get drunk Saturday night. You miss the whole point. Jesus is at a marriage feast, which a marriage feast was the biggest celebration among the Jewish people. They celebrated a lot of things, had a lot of festivals, but when they had a marriage, it was a big to-do. It lasted for days. But the miracle that Jesus performed here, he didn't perform for the audience of the person who he performed it for. The host wasn't around when Jesus turned the water into wine. But what we don't understand is, in this story, there were 6 barrels, stone barrels, because the Jews like to use that rather than clay pots. There were 6 barrels that contained 20 gallons of water. But it wasn't just any kind of water that was in these barrels. It was cleansing, ceremonial cleansing water. Now, we baptize people, and that's about our limit of what we know about a ceremonial cleansing. But the Jewish people had ceremonial cleansing all throughout their life. When John the Baptist started baptizing people in the Jordan River, it wasn't a big deal to the Jewish people because they were used to these cleansing ceremonies. But when Jesus turned the cleansing water into wine, he eliminated the cleansing. If people came into that wedding ceremony and they wanted to do a ceremonial cleansing, they couldn't because all of their water was now wine. You understand? He was saying that your system has lost its value, and I have replaced it with something else. It was a great act of God showing that the blood of Christ is going to totally wipe out the old system. The old system's not needed anymore. You can't use it anymore. The barrels were full. They were full, and they were full of wine when Jesus got done with them. That's why when Jesus shared the bread and the cup at the end, he said this wine, he said, this represents my blood, which is shed for you, the new covenant. The old covenant is dead. When Jesus turned the water into wine, he was showing them that he was God that reigned above the priests, who only worked with ceremonial cleansings and the blood of animals. It was a foreshadowing of the marriage supper of the Lamb, when Jesus is going to provide the meal. That's what that was all about. And that's what John caught John's attention. John concludes with the promise of Jesus' return. And that becomes the prequel to his final work, which is the book of Revelation. Now, there are four faces. If you read the scripture, there are four faces. When we see the throne of God, it talks about four faces that we see. It's interesting that each time we encounter the super angels of heaven, the cherubim, the seraphim that surround the throne of God, we note that there are four faces involved: the face of a lion, the face of an ox, the face of a man, and the face of an eagle. These were also the principal tribal standards that rallied the four camps of Israel. Each of them stood under one of those symbols. Each camp consisted of 3 tribes that encamped around the tabernacle in order and were represented by one of these faces. It's interesting that each of these faces are suggestive of the 4 Gospels. Matthew representing the lion of Judah, Mark the ox, which is a classic emblem of servanthood, Luke the son of man, and John the son of the God in the heavens. Now before we go on, I want you to note that the order of the New Testament books has nothing to do with the date which they were written. Just like we had in the Old Testament. It isn't like it's a newspaper and it goes straight through. The New Testament is not in chronological order. The New Testament is not in chronological order. And as we get on, maybe next week we'll get into a little bit of where this all falls. Now you remember when we did that in the Old Testament and how we took the prophets, the major and minor prophets, and we put them into the historical times in which they belonged. And then the Old Testaments begin to make a lot more sense. We're also going to do that with the New. All right, the first book in this group is the book of Matthew, Jesus the Messiah. The author of the book is Matthew, one-time tax collector. God went to the IRS, he called Matthew, Matthew got saved, and Matthew became an apostle. Now, this is crazy. You know, if you think to me, if you're going to call somebody in the ministry, you call somebody that people trusted. But Matthew became one of the original members of the 12. He, as a publican, which was the Roman tax collector of the day, Matthew would have been an extortioner. And he had been despised by his fellow man, just pretty much like a tax collector would be today. Nothing's much changed over the years. But Luke tells us that Matthew made a great feast for Jesus, and he forsook everything that he had to follow him. Matthew doesn't even mention that. Luke tells that. He lost sight of himself. He lost his love for money in his adoration for Jesus. What humility he had. This is also an example of the grace of God, because God chose this man. As crooked as he had been and as unloved as he was, he chose him to be the author of what is said to be the most widely read book in all the world, the book of Matthew. The date of the book of Matthew was written around 50 to 60 A.D., thereabouts. 50 or 60 years after Christ. This is important too. It was written to the Jews in Syria and Palestine. If you know who something is addressed to, it makes a whole lot more sense when you read it, doesn't it? I mean, if you come home from work and there's a note on the refrigerator that says, clean up the room, make the bed, feed the dog. You know, you guys might get a little irritated about that till you realize that that message is to your kid. So it's important to know who it's addressed to. The message of Matthew concentrates on Jesus as the Messiah, as I said before, the Christ who's predicted by the Old Testament. However, the Jews of his time were expecting a political leader. They were expecting somebody who would free them from Roman domination. And Matthew is very careful to relate that Jesus' kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. It's not a political kingdom. Now, here's just a few things you need to know about the book of Matthew. Of course, it contains the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew shows Jesus as a descendant from the royal lineage of King David. Luke's list entails Joseph's particular line. Matthew's list is stylized and abbreviated to fit a pattern. And here's the pattern. There are 14 names from Abraham to David, 14 names from David to Jeconiah, 14 names from Jeconiah to Jesus. And this is even more interesting. The Hebrew letters in the name David add up to 14. Now, I know you might think God's not in that. You know, Tebow threw for 316 yards and had John 3:16 on his eye thing, on his face, and people thought, oh, that couldn't have been God. But I think God does stuff like that, you know. There are some parables that are only in the book of Matthew. And if you begin to understand the personality of the author, you're also going to understand why he has some of these are in his book. The parable of the tares, the hidden treasure, the pearl of great price, the dragnet, the hard-hearted servant, the workers in the vineyard, the 2 sons, the marriage of the king's son, and the 10 bridesmaids, and the talents are in the book of Matthew. A lot of them have to do with money. Amazing. The tax collector. There are miracles that are only in Matthew. The 2 blind men, the dumb man who was possessed, and the coin in the fish's mouth. I think Matthew probably found that fascinating. There are specific messages only in Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount, the giving us the standard for discipleship in Matthew 5-7. Jesus coming in the end of the world, Matthew 24. The Great Commission, Matthew 28:19 and 20. All found in Matthew. But again, Matthew was concerned with what? That Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus was the Messiah. Okay? The book of Mark, Jesus is the servant. The author, of course, is John Mark, the son of Mary, whose home in Jerusalem was a meeting place for the disciples in Acts chapter 12. It was the home to which Peter went when God's angel released him from prison. You remember that story. Went to Mark's house. Mark went with Paul and Barnabas to Antioch, and he started with them on their first missionary journey. But the Bible says in Acts 13 that he turned back. He wanted to go with Paul then on his second missionary journey, but Paul refused to take him because he turned around and went home on the first one. And of course, you know the story. This occasioned the separation of Paul and Barnabas. They had such a disagreement that there was a harsh split between the two of them. Imagine that, 2 Christian men. But God just sent out missionaries in 2 different directions. So Mark went with Barnabas to Cyprus. But here's how God works. 12 years later, Mark appears in Rome with Paul. Colossians chapter 4. And then 5 years after that, at Paul's desk, he asked for Mark to come to him in 2 Timothy chapter 4. So they did make up. It wasn't a forever fight. It was only a difference of opinion. It was written somewhere between 57 and 63 A.D., again, after the time of Christ. But his book was written to the Gentiles in Rome. Now, that's really important. That's really important. Whether a book is written to the Jews or whether it's written to the Gentiles or to the general public, he wrote his book specifically to the Gentiles who are living in Rome. The Gentiles would be the people that didn't have the background. They didn't have the background that the Jewish people had. They didn't have the tradition in mind. They had worldliness and they had paganism and all of this. So Mark's appeal has to be to these people. Mark is a book of action. Since the Roman mind was interested in power, Mark deliberately omitted the birth and the childhood accounts of Jesus, and he moved right into the miraculous ministry of Jesus. He would argue from Christ's miracles to his deity, and then to the greatest miracle and display of power the world has ever seen, his death and resurrection, because he wanted the Gentiles in Rome to understand. Here's a cool thing to know about the book of Mark. Mark is hidden in the other Gospels. Practically the entire book of Mark can be found within the other Gospels. Of the 661 verses in the book of Mark, 610 are parallel to Matthew and Luke. Of the 88 separate paragraphs in Mark, only 3 are absent from Matthew and Luke. Almost all of Mark is found in the other books. Early tradition has it that Mark was a companion of the Apostle Peter. 1 Peter chapter 5 talks about it. It's believed that Mark's version of Jesus' miracles came from listening to the stories and the teachings of Peter, who saw it all firsthand. Now, there's some accounts that are only in Mark. The parable of the seed growing secretly, the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida, and the flight of the young man, only in the Gospel of Mark. And then we get to Luke. Okay? Luke shows Jesus as the Son of Man. The author, of course, is Luke, only mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. Only 3 times. Indicating he was with Paul in the dark hours approaching Paul's death. Philemon 24, 2 Timothy 4:11 tells us that he was there. So all of these guys, though separate in ministry, they were very tight with each other, very close. His gospel is part 1 of a 2-part history of Christian beginnings, Luke and the book of Acts. When I was in Bible college, I minored in Greek. I was 1 semester from a biblical language major. 1 more semester of Hebrew, and I would have been a major in biblical languages, and I'd had another piece of paper to set up on my shelf that nobody would read. And so I didn't want to take the class, so I didn't do it. But anyhow, when I was taking Greek, we would have to translate every day. And this will show you a distinction between some of these guys. The first book that we translated was the Gospel of John. It was the easiest. It was the easiest. John was about as common as you could be. The language of John was very common, and it was a much easier book to translate from the Greek to English. We would get so many verses, and we'd have to we couldn't cheat. We had to know the words and translate. When I moved up a level, in my second year of taking Greek, we started translating the Gospel of Luke. Day and night difference in how the 2 of those men wrote. Day and night difference in the language. I knew after the first couple of days of translating from Luke that Luke had to be a doctor. He just had to be a doctor. Both of the books that Luke wrote were dedicated to the same man, Theophilus. That name means beloved of God. It's the fullest life story of Jesus that we possess. It's carefully compiled from reliable first-hand sources, and it aims at the whole truth of what happened in Palestine in Jesus' lifetime. Luke took a doctor's approach. Details. Again, it was written somewhere between 63 and 68 A.D. Luke's gospel was written to all interested Gentiles, the Greeks, anybody. The Romans, the Greeks, but kind of aimed at towards the Greeks, but everybody. His message, Luke relates those things concerning Jesus which demonstrate how entirely human Jesus was. You know, if we look at Jesus as just from the perspective of some of the other Gospels and say, well, yeah, he's just God through and through. When you look at Jesus then going to Gethsemane and praying, and you look at Jesus being beaten with a cat of 9 tails, and you look at Jesus being crucified, you think, well, he was just God through and so therefore it wasn't really a big deal. He didn't really have the pain. He didn't suffer the agony. But Luke shows us the humanity of Jesus. That Jesus felt what any one of us would have felt in the same situation. That he would have had the same feelings, he would have had the same emotions, he would have had the same pain that any of us would have had. While Matthew traces his genealogy as a king, Luke traces his genealogy to Adam, proving that even though Jesus is the Son of God, that he is the branch, he is still qualified to be the sacrifice for man's sin. You see, when man fell into sin, maybe you're familiar with this, but when Adam and Eve fell into sin, Eve tripped, Adam jumped in. He went in after his bride. But when that took place, the only way man could be redeemed is if man fixed the problem. But since man was cursed, man couldn't fix his problem. Therefore, God needed another man. He needed a God-man, a man that was all man and yet he was all God, who could step into the situation and resolve it. The perfect sacrifice. Now, there's some things to know about the Gospel of Luke. Luke emphasizes the prayer life of Jesus. And he gives us Jesus' instructional prayer in chapter 11. He also emphasizes the work of the Holy Spirit, which continues on into the book of Acts, his second book. There are a lot of parables that are only found in the Gospel of Luke. Luke has much more than all the rest. The two debtors, the Good Samaritan, the friend asking for bread at midnight, the rich fool in his barns, the watchful servants, the barren fig tree, the chief seats at the wedding feast, the great supper, the builder who didn't finish, the king who sought counsel, the lost coin, the prodigal son, the clever steward, the unprofitable servants, the widow and the judge, the Pharisee and the publican, and the servants in the pounds. All found in the Gospel of Luke. There are also some miracles that we only find in the Gospel of Luke. The catch of fish, the raising of the widow's son at Nain, the healing of the woman with an 18-year-old spirit of infirmity, the healing of the man with dropsy, the cleansing of the 10 lepers, and the healing of Malchus' ear that had been cut off by Peter. Isn't it amazing that these are the things a doctor would pick out to address? Here's an interesting note, too. Quantity-wise, Luke wrote more of the New Testament than Paul did. You know, we always think of Paul that, well, Paul wrote most of the New Testament. He wrote most of the books. But if you added up the words, Luke wrote more of the New Testament than the Apostle Paul did. And then lastly, we get to the Gospel of John. John talks about Jesus as the Son of God. The author of this book doesn't identify himself until the end of the book, chapter 21, where he states that he is the disciple whom Jesus loved. Chapter 13, chapter 20, that he is John the Apostle. John was the son of Zebedee, the brother of James, and the business partner of Peter and Andrew. He and his brother James carried the nickname Sons of Thunder, found in Mark chapter 3, verse 17. I've also been told that at Anderson, me and my brother Bob are called that. It's also possible that he was Jesus' earthly cousin, his mother Salome being Mary's sister. This is a connected group. Where all of the other books were written 50s to 60s A.D., John wasn't written till around 90 A.D., 90 years after the time of Christ. John's book was written to the general population of all of Asia Minor. He wrote it to the world, the known world. The message of John consists mainly of Jesus' discourses and Jesus' conversations. He records more of what Jesus said, especially about himself, than the things that Jesus did. He's the most selective of any of the gospel writers because over 90% of his content is found exclusively in his book. Where the other three are referred to as the synoptic gospels, in other words, they are all related, they're all kind of telling of the same story, John is out here by himself. John selects from the many miracles of Jesus certain signs which reveal clearly who Jesus was. What makes that even more interesting is that most of the events recorded in John take place in and around Jerusalem. They take place at various festivals which according to the Old Testament were meant to point to the people to their Messiah, the Son of God. Things to know. There are no parables in the Gospel of John. No parables. Of the 8 miracles recorded in John, only 2 are mentioned anywhere else. The feeding of the 5,000 and walking on the water. John was one of the inner circle of Jesus. He was one of the 3 who was allowed to see Jesus when he was transfigured. He's one who saw him restore Jairus' daughter to life. You remember Jesus said, shut the door, leave everybody outside. He was one of the 3 that got to see Jesus raise her to life. And he was one who was near him in the garden at the Gethsemane. John was in the very inner circle of Jesus. It was when Jesus was on the cross, he looked down at Mary and he said to John, "Behold thy mother," and to Mary, "Behold thy son." And he committed Mary into the care of John. John was a pretty special guy. In the Gospel of John, there are the I ams of Jesus. The word I am. You have to go back to the time of Moses. When God was sending Moses to Egypt, and Moses said, "Who should I tell him sent me?" And God said, "You tell him I am sent you." I am sent you. Today we don't grasp how scary that title is. But that I am title meant God. To the Jews, that would be something that probably they would whisper, or if they said it at all. I am. When Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am," in John 8:58, everyone knew that he was claiming the very name of God. And Jesus emphasized, John emphasized that claim. Jesus said, "I am God." That's why the Jews wanted to kill him. He said, "I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door, the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life and the way and the truth. I am the true vine." In chapter 10 and verse 30, Jesus said, "I and my Father are one." And in chapter 14, verse 9, he said, "He that has seen me has seen the Father." Now you understand why the Jews wanted to kill him. He took an Old Testament terminology descriptive of Yahweh. And the Jews didn't even say God's name back then. When a scribe would write down the name of God, he would bathe, cleanse himself, get a new quill, write Yahweh's name. Then he would go cleanse himself again, bathe, change clothes, and come back and write the next word. That's how sacred the name of God was. You see how far we've come when we use the name of God as a swear word. There are miracles that are only unique to the Gospel of John. The turning of the water into wine that I talked about. The healing of the nobleman's son. The healing of the impotent man. The healing of the blind man. The raising of Lazarus from the dead. And the providing of the catch of fish. Things that only God himself could do. Okay, that's the first package. Any questions? I did all the talking. Now it's your turn. I believe it was to show the intimacy that he had. I mean, Jesus loved everybody. But when you see the picture that Leonardo's picture, I think, is you see John leaning in on Jesus. You know, I think it has something to do with the passion, the relationship. You know, John would have known Jesus his whole life. You know, if they were relatives, he would have known him his whole life. And just the closeness, I think that's how John related to it. You know, I'm the one that he loves. Not meaning he didn't love anybody else. But John felt this, you know, it was a feeling on the inside of him. It was how he related to Jesus. Anybody else? Well, I'm glad you understand everything. You must be an excellent teacher. We're going to take this segment at a time. We're going to get into the Acts of the Apostles. And as I said, that is a history book. That means that it covers a broad period of time. That also means that some of these other New Testament books is going to fall into that period of time. You remember how we took 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and we took those major and minor prophets and we shoved them into there where they belong. We're going to do the same thing with the Acts of the Apostles, and we're going to show you what belongs at that time. So when you read the story that's going on in a certain chapter of Acts, you might also be able to go read a letter that corresponds to that time. It's going to add a whole new dimension as to how you see what you read in Acts and also what you see in that book. And hopefully take some of your fear of the New Testament away. Okay? You know, I go from this group to a few weeks ago, Jimmy asked me to teach junior youth. I thought he said junior high. I was ready for junior high. I was equipped. I went in, and it's 5th and 6th graders. Let me tell you something. There's day and night difference between them and you. It was never quiet in that room. There were always questions. When I say, does anybody have any questions? Yeah, what do you think weather's going to be like tomorrow? You know, it had nothing to do with the subject. But it did explain a lot about their parents, though, after I met the kids. But I got all done with it. I finished at 8 o'clock. I'm out walking out in the fellowship hall, and they said, what are you doing out here? I said, I'm done. But it's only 8 o'clock. I said, I'm done. I am finished, but it's only 8 o'clock. I said, I don't care, but I am done. and I went to Jim. I said, I don't have the stamina to handle that class again. I'm used to people like you that just, you have any questions? That's my speed. All right, let's close in a word of prayer. Father, I thank you tonight that we can learn your word. And God, we have to learn this. We have to learn this. God, we're living in the final days. The enemy knows exactly what he's doing. The people that follow him are dedicated to his cause. But God, we in the church sit back. We don't even know our own book. God, we have to learn this. If we're going to be equipped to be able to fight in these final days, we're going to have to be equipped to be able to preach the good news to people that need to hear it and understand why they need to hear it and what the good news is. God, we need to understand this and know it if we're going to become the people that we need to be, the examples that we need to be. People need to be able to look at us and need to be able to look at this church and see who God is. God, that means we need to change some things. We need to get things right. We need to get them in the proper order so that when people look at us and they look at the church, they don't just see a building, they don't see a denomination, they don't see a bunch of free-for-all people, but God, they see a unity, a unified presence that shows the image of who you are. But God, to do that, we need to know what the book says. We need to understand it in depth. We need to study it. We need to spend time with it. We need to embrace it. God, we need to apply it to our lives. Father, I thank you for allowing us the freedom in this country, in this place, to be able to do that. A lot of places around the world don't have it. We have it. God, might we take advantage of the moment and learn your book. In Jesus' name.
Thank you for watching today's message from Free Christian Church of God in Continental, Ohio. To find out more information about Free Christian Church of God, or to receive a copy of Reverend James Fry's weekly television program, Your Life, call the church office at area code 419-596-3103 or visit our website at freecog.org and download your copy today.